So, John, the 8th generation of video games is slowly but surely wrapping up. I think the last standing elements of it are the Nintendo Switch, PS4, and Xbox One. Of course, the Nintendo Switch, there is the debate, like, does this count as a 9th generation console? What do you think with that? Because it's very interesting. The Switch launched before the Xbox One X, so I feel like that maybe keeps it in the 8th gen. What do you think? Where do you think the Switch lies there?
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Because I guess the Wii U was at the end of 360 and PlayStation 3, really. It was only a year or two before PS4. I kind of think Nintendo just kind of goes to their own beat. They don't really sit in the same generation as anyone else. They just kind of do their own thing. But just logistically, I think it's more PS4 than it is PS5.
And I think overall, like, when you look at where it lies in the lifespan of 8th generation consoles like the PS4 and Xbox One, it's pretty much right in the middle of that generation until the PS5 launches, because the PS4 was 2013, 3 to 4 years later, Switch, 3 to 4 years later, PS5, Xbox Series X, so I think it fits in there. But yeah, I think it's interesting to take a look at each generation and just kind of talk about our experiences, just the general vibe we got from that generation as a whole, and just maybe look back at it and kind of figure out, like, what was the main thing about this generation, because it feels like every generation has its own feel, has its own kind of style, where during the 7th generation, it was all about kind of that brown and gray first-person shooter kind of thing. That was kind of like, oh, that's what a lot of people really, like, considered the 7th generation, at least, like, when it was going on. I remember it was like, oh, yeah, all games look like this. That's kind of what a lot of things were going for. And even if there's still a lot of variety in the 7th generation, that's kind of the stereotypical, I think, 7th generation kind of game. But, you know, a lot of the 5th generation, 6th generation kind of feels like, oh, this feels like it's from that era. What do you remember from the 8th generation the most? How do you think it stacks up compared to other generations of game consoles? And what do you think was, like, the main thing from this generation?
It's a hard one to quantify, almost, because it felt like at the beginning it was kind of continuing the previous generation. Like, it took a year or two to really understand what PS4 was. And their tagline then was "Greatness awaits." And it was like we had to sort of wait for it to really start, because it was mostly cross-gen games. And it took until around Bloodborne and The Witcher 3, I think, for PS4 to really take off. I mean, sales-wise, it always took off, but just in terms of its identity, that's kind of how long it took. Whereas Xbox had this big uphill battle where they kind of lost from the start. Because, you know, when they revealed Xbox One, it was DRM, you had to always be online, you couldn't trade your games. There were all these sort of problems against them, and Sony could very easily take over the narrative by posting videos like, here's how you trade games on PS4, and they just hand it over. And Xbox was also more expensive, and it came with Kinect, and it was weaker. Like, games ran at 720p rather than 1080p. So it kind of felt like Xbox had all the negatives, and PS4 just kind of won by default. But Xbox slowly became more and more appealing, I suppose, as time went on, but it took a while. PS4 just kind of had that lead. They didn't have to do anything. They just had to be a standard console, and they already had the lead. In terms of, like, how you actually judge the generation, I think there's a lot of open world games, there's a lot of just kind of narrative-focused games, but I don't think it has that sort of, you know, de facto, like, this is what that generation was, unlike previous ones, because it was pretty varied.
This was the generation where anything could be a game, anybody could make a game kind of thing, where, like, the indie scene really started to flourish with the Xbox 360, you know, the 7th generation, but it really exploded in this gen, where it felt like each year, it felt like an indie game or two really had a chance to win, like, Game of the Year that year, where you had stuff like Celeste, The Witness, Undertale, and just, like, brand new things pop up that, you know, you hadn't heard of before. Stuff like PUBG, which could be considered like, oh man, that battle royale live service kind of model could be kind of considered like, oh, that was this generation's thing. That's what this generation kind of started. It just kind of shows, like, how things were opening up, but also closing at the same time, where it felt like companies like Sony were becoming a lot more like, hey, this is what we make. Whereas the generation went on, they started putting out less and less games, which could be because, like, hey, development costs rising significantly with this generation. Sony just decided kind of like, hey, let's just kind of make these really big single-player story-driven games and experiences and stop doing as much stuff as they were in kind of like the PS3, PS2, PS1 era, which I mean, like, hey, like, we're getting these bigger, more fully fleshed out games, but we're also kind of not getting as much of like those AA experiences.
I guess indies sort of took over that sort of AA area. I think Sony were very influenced by The Last of Us. Like, that just sort of influenced every other game they made. And it was kind of the last hurrah of their Japanese side. Like, Japan's studio wouldn't die really until the end of the PS4 era, but in terms of their output, like, we got Gravity Rush 1 and 2, we got Everybody's Golf, I guess The Last Guardian, because that was in development for a long time. Outside of that, though, Japan's studio were mostly an assist team. Like, they assisted with Bloodborne, but they really didn't get many opportunities to do much outside of remasters like Parappa the Rapper and Patapon. But we didn't really get those sort of wacky Sony Japan games in the PS4 era.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. It felt like a lot of those just silly off-the-wall games, it felt like Nintendo had to kind of pick up a lot of that slack within the industry this generation. Sony was still going off the walls bonkers during the PS3 era, which is some of their stuff, even if it wasn't that great. Stuff like Kung Fu Rider for the PlayStation Move. It just kind of felt like this generation was where Sony was starting to get a lot more just laser focused, and it did work out for them. I mean, the PS4 was a roaring success, and it was like the console this generation until technically, looking at the sales numbers, you know, the Switch did overtake it, and the Switch kind of became like, this is the dominant system this generation technically. But yeah, it felt like Sony became a lot more laser focused on everything. Microsoft was just kind of there for most of it.
It's kind of wild.
Yeah. Putting out games, they put out games, but it made me kind of look at Xbox as a whole with like their exclusive games and what they would put out. I think a lot of the problems stem from the fact that they never really had like any teams that they ever like formed themselves. It was always kind of like, hey, let's just and whenever they would form teams, it would kind of be to pick up where other teams left off with stuff like 343, the Coalition. Taking care of the Halo and Gears of War series. But it always just kind of felt like Microsoft would buy or fund exclusives made by other people, which is fine. But I think that feeling really permeated throughout this generation for them. No game really had that Microsoft feel or really felt like it really meant anything in the grand scheme of things on Xbox. A lot of their exclusives just kind of were like, here's another reason to feel content with owning an Xbox. That's about it.
Xbox One sold pretty well in the end. Like, I think it sold like 50 million, 60 million, which is a good number. It's not near PS4, but it's a decent number.
It did fine enough. It did fine enough for like how it launched, you know, like for that PR disaster. I think it did pretty good in the end.
Right, because they launched with it with Kinect, which was a pretty big bump to the price. And no game really utilized Kinect in an interesting way. There's like Kinect Sports, but there wasn't much that really used it. They were double downing on TV as well. They wanted you to be using your Kinect as this sort of media hub, but no one really wanted that. So it took them a long time to really get past that. I think Xbox One S and One X were kind of the savior of the system, but they did some cool stuff. Like Killer Instinct was a great game. Master Chief Collection became a great game, but it was a huge disaster when it came out. Halo 5 was divisive. Like Quantum Break was a pretty good game, but like it was so scattered. There was very few reasons like this is why you need an Xbox One over a PS4. I think now with like Game Pass, they've really not defined themselves necessarily, but they've given a reason for why you might have it over PlayStation. But for most of its life, it was hard to find a real reason.
That was just the feeling that I felt during that entire generation, where for a while Microsoft would really try just at least giving like exclusives, just having enough exclusives pretty much. But a lot of them just always kind of felt like, you know, it was just a random game they decided to help fund. I remember Super Lucky's Tale in 2017. It's a fine game. But it's also like, it just kind of felt like Microsoft was kind of filling that gap and checking something off the list where it's like, all right, here's our kids game. There we go.
Rise of the Tomb Raider was a very divisive one, because that game was going to happen regardless, and people were very mad. that they made that exclusive for a year, I think. It's a good game, but it's just like, why is this exclusive? The way a lot of people saw it is, I mean, we know Tomb Raider started on the Saturn, but people have always sort of seen it as a PlayStation franchise, and so for this one to be exclusive to Xbox, timed, was kind of bizarre.
It's very interesting. I remember that E3, the year that Rise of the Tomb Raider was launching that holiday, Microsoft was trying to show, like, we have, like, the best experiences with the best characters and all that, and they show, like, Master Chief.
The Forza car was in there.
Yeah, they showed Master Chief and Lara Croft and the Forza car, Marcus Phoenix. It did show kind of, like, their problem with competing with Sony and Nintendo in that regard. You don't need, like, a mascot these days, even though Master Chief is easily Xbox's. Xbox is Gears of War, Halo, Forza. That's their thing. Should they have more variety? Sure. But I think what Microsoft found was, like, okay, if we're gonna try and, like, build up our catalog to have, like, all these colorful characters or just, like, all these legacy characters and all of that can compete with Nintendo's and PlayStation's, like, we could try to do that, or we could try to just do something different and compete in that way. And I think that's maybe how we got something like Game Pass, where it's like, hey, like, you kind of get the best of both worlds, where you do get a lot of exclusive Xbox games this way. Some games that would only exist because of Game Pass, where I believe it was like Pentiment that came out, that's pretty much like, yeah, if it wasn't for Game Pass, if it wasn't for being bought by Microsoft, because it was made by Obsidian, this game wouldn't exist. I feel like that's more interesting than if Microsoft just tried to be like, we're gonna make another thing like Blinks, or like, we're gonna make a Fusion Frenzy 3 to compete with Mario Party and all of that. And this may be kind of the last generation, I guess, just because the 9th generation, yeah, it's here, but I don't know, with how Xbox is going, like, it feels like the entire concept of generations is changing as we know it.
I still don't really feel like we know what Series X can do, and this sort of goes to PS5 as well. It just kind of feels like an extension of what came before, and we already kind of had that, because this generation introduced, like, the Pro system, like a more powerful version of PS4 and Xbox One. And it feels like we're kind of in that again at the moment, which is kind of interesting. I think PS5 and Series X will find themselves more as they go on. But yes, right now, like, some of the biggest games of this era are like Elden Ring, which is also a PS4 game, which is kind of strange. But I think, like, looking back, Xbox is more interesting to talk about, not necessarily because it's better. I think PS4 was just kind of a smooth ride the entire time. Like, it had lots of big games, had lots of diverse games, whereas Xbox had this uphill battle against it. There's things like Fable Legends, which was a big game that just got cancelled, and that was Fable out for that entire era.
It's interesting, like, looking back, Xbox did have a couple of massive cancellations this generation, and you had Scalebound, you had Fable Legends, you also had the Phantom Dust remake, or whatever, even though that, like, kinda came out in the form of a remaster that they just put out for free, which is really, like, it's really bizarre, like, what happened there. And I think that shows, like, there's a lot of problems going on behind the scenes with, like, Xbox, like, game development in terms of just, like, getting stuff done or just having stuff that won't get canceled, I guess. It's because, like, we're still having that problem. We're still seeing that problem a bit today, where 2019, we got, like, Gears 5, and then after that, not much for, like, that next year. And then we had to wait a while until we got, like, Halo Infinite in 2021. And, of course, there was stuff in between there. There was, like, Ori.
Battletoads.
Yeah, Battletoads. There you go. And then we had to wait another year because 2022, there was basically nothing from Microsoft.
I couldn't tell you a single game that they published.
Like I said, there was Pentiment. That's about all I can think of. So, yeah, I think this generation, Microsoft was struggling a bit with game development, and I think that has kind of bled into the next generation. But Sony themselves, they did pretty okay throughout the entire generation. When I say pretty okay, I actually mean pretty good, because overall they had some of the biggest games this generation, some of their best games of all time. But the problem is, like, I wouldn't say the problem, it's more so they went for quality over quantity, which is good, but it did kind of, like, sting a little bit going from that PS3, that last year of PS3, where we got, like, 12 games. They're all pretty good.
There's stuff like Puppeteer. It's like this, it's something you wouldn't play anywhere else, and it was so cool that a first party was funding all these games. And then we went from stuff like experimental stuff like that to very, very sort of guaranteed to be safe stuff. Like Horizon, for instance. People love Horizon, but it's also just kind of your typical open world game.
That's my thought on it, where I played a bit of both. I played the first Horizon for a couple hours, and I played the second one for an hour or so, and yeah, I mean, it's good. Like, it's just like, I think it would be ridiculous to act like it's not good, but
it's high quality, yeah.
It just kind of feels like, yep, this is a quality game. It just doesn't really grab me. It feels very much like select waypoint, go there, select waypoint, go there. And that's fine, because a lot of games are like that, and they're still good games, but Horizon just hasn't done enough to really grab me, and it feels kind of like this is a good series for Sony to continue, propping up, but it feels like a series that if it was on PS3, it would be in addition to multiple different series. It wouldn't be kind of like the only one. It really did feel like even in years where Sony just didn't really have a lot, they still did go for that. Like, we're not going to put out as much stuff. Those first few years of PS4 were a little sparse. It didn't have the greatest launch. The Sony titles were Knack and Killzone. I think that was it.
Yeah.
Which would you choose? Which would you choose?
I think I'll choose Knack.
That is fair. Killzone, at least, man, it's another Guerrilla game. Like, we're talking some mad smack on Guerrilla Games titles right now. It's Killzone Shadowfall is another, like, it's fine, but it's also like I think as much as like Horizon kind of feels like just like a solid, fine open world game, Killzone is just another that's a fine first person shooter.
I don't want to be like congratulating Xbox like, oh, what a comeback, because they were down most of the generation, and PS4 definitely was steady. It was definitely a lot of good output. But I also feel like Naughty Dog, they would often sort of redefine themselves every generation. Like for PS1 it was Crash, PS2 it was Jak, PS3 it was Uncharted and The Last of Us, and then PS4 it was like Uncharted and The Last of Us again. It's just kind of that continuation of that sort of safe feeling, which it's smart. They're big brands, they've got movies and TV shows now. None of it is a knock against them. It's just, as someone who kind of wants them to experiment more, it is a little bit deflating that they just kind of keep the same series going again.
Yeah, Naughty Dog had a good output this generation. However, it was like you were saying, it's a bit of a safe output. I really enjoyed Uncharted 4. I have a lot of great memories of just like that year. Pretty much that was like my last year of high school. I remember like that holiday, I sat down and I picked up the Nathan Drake collection. I went through all 3 games, really enjoyed myself, and it was like day after I graduated, pretty much, I picked up Uncharted 4 and played through that, and it was a great time. And especially around that time, that was when PS4 was kind of starting to pick up steam, because we also got like Ratchet and Clank around that as well. And it was just a really, really fun time to own a PS4 for me during that. But Uncharted 4, looking back, even during then, I felt like it felt a little too bloated. Like, it went on for a little long. It felt like 3, while it didn't feel like a conclusion to the series, it felt like a natural, just like, all right, like, after that, 4 just kind of feels like you're kind of trying to be like, oh, what if he had a brother? And what if he had, like, all this stuff? Because it's just like, all right, well, you never mentioned this before. So it just kind of felt like, it felt like a good conclusion. It was a good conclusion to Uncharted, but it also kind of felt a little like Naughty Dog kind of already felt a little done with the series. Maybe, I don't know. But yeah, that and The Lost Legacy, which was a cool little side game for Uncharted.
Yeah, I
but
that.
It was more so kind of like the standalone DLC kind of style of game that they do, where it's like, oh, this is more Uncharted 4 and a smaller Uncharted 4, but
which they did with Infamous as well. We had Second Son and was it First Light?
Yeah, I believe it was First Light. That's something that really started to happen this generation, kind of that standalone expansion kind of, I mean, like, they've done it before, but they really started to do it with a lot more titles this generation. I know Wolfenstein had a couple of those.
Xenoblade had Torna.
There's a lot where it's just like, yeah, this is kind of being developed as if it was like DLC, but kind of spruced up a lot to be its own game, which is pretty cool. Ubisoft did it a lot with like the Far Cry series. I know there was like Primal, New Dawn, which is a cool thing to do. But Naughty Dog also did The Last of Us Part 2, which I barely played much of. It's another one where it's like, by the time it came out, I was like, I'll get to this at some point, but not right now. Especially everybody, a lot of people did not really like some things they did in The Last of Us 2, so it was just like, I'll wait to play this when, it's a little more dust has settled. It did feel like Naughty Dog was just kind of coasting along, even though they were really pushing graphics this generation. But it did kind of feel like that for a lot of Sony's first-party output. It felt like it was just like, let's just do what makes sense and really push like visuals, because that's what Sony really did better than any other studio, in my opinion, was just the quality of visuals that they were able to get out of the PS4. Insane. Absolutely fantastic.
It's crazy. The games that are coming out now for PS5, like Miles Morales, it's got like ray tracing and everything, but it's still very comparable to the PS4 version, which just kind of speaks to what they were achieving there. And yeah, Spider-Man. Like, Insomniac made a Spider-Man game, and it's really, really good. I don't think it's like a revolutionary take on Spider-Man. Like, there have been previous Spider-Man games, like Spider-Man 2, which sort of followed the same template, but it's definitely of a different tier in quality. You know, Spider-Man's one of the biggest brands in the world now, and Spider-Man 2 is probably one of the most anticipated games coming up. And Insomniac have just kind of put themselves as probably their most consistent studio, I'd say. Like, they put out Rift Apart and Spider-Man 2, they're kind of carrying the PS5. I don't think Insomniac really had a huge output in this generation. It was really just Ratchet and Clank.
Well, Sunset Overdrive too.
Yeah, Sunset Overdrive, yeah.
That is pretty interesting.
Yeah, Xbox exclusive, which was kind of weird after the big PlayStation relationship.
They weren't owned by Sony until like 2019. Yeah, 2019, 2018, around then. Yeah, so it's pretty wild that it took that long for them to get owned by Sony. But yeah, Sunset Overdrive, which that may be like one of the better Xbox One exclusives during the generation, and did not do very well, but it was still pretty. It was pretty fun. I think Insomniac, like you were saying, like Spider-Man isn't like this revolutionary game, but I think what Insomniac always does well, they make really good-looking games that are really fun. Like, and that's kind of it, where it's just like, it's not like, wow, oh my god. You look at the game design and all the numbers are floating around in your head like, wow, this all clicks together perfectly. I mean, it does in Insomniac games, but it's not like a Breath of the Wild where you can see like, oh, this leads to this, and this is the reason it is because of this, and blah, blah, blah. You can connect all the dots, and you can see how they balanced the game and how they designed everything like so well. Where Insomniac games, you can do that if you analyze them, but for the most part, they're just good fun, you know? Yeah. Like, so that's how I always view a lot of their titles. Sony's output, a lot of it was like remasters for a bit, which I think is another big element of this generation, was the remaster, the port, all of that. Where it felt like what required a remaster, what requires like an HD remake, all of that did change this generation a bit compared to the Xbox 360 era. Because it really felt like it's just like, if you're gonna port the last generation game in HD, better be a part of a collection of games that we're just gonna fart out in this resolution, and it's whatever, or we're gonna make it a downloadable title kind of thing. In this generation, it really felt like they really invested a lot more into making sure, like, hey, if we're gonna do a remaster, if we're gonna do a remake, we really want to make sure it's like, you know, really high quality. And also, like, remasters really kind of helped us get through a lot of software droughts during the PS4 generation, and even the Nintendo Switch when that came out. Do you think that was why they did not put out these consoles did not initially include backwards compatibility? Do you think it was these sneaky little executives behind the scenes that were saying like, well, we could resell 360 games?
It could be. I know on the PlayStation side, PS3 is just notoriously hard to carry forward. They're still not doing it, they're just streaming it on PS5. Yeah. With Xbox, it's hard to tell, because that Master Chief Collection clearly wasn't embracing, you know, the having your previous disc. They're selling you the same game again. But Xbox were the ones who did backwards compatibility in the end. I think with PlayStation, it was more just they were working for what they had. But early on, with stuff like Tomb Raider Definitive Edition, there was a pushback against it, because it was still a fairly recent game.
Really weird looking back at it, you know?
Yeah. And people were like, why should I buy that again? But it did very well. I think The Last of Us Remastered might have been the one that kind of set the standard there.
Which is weird, because that seems like it would be like, it's just like, that was literally just a year later. And it was like, even calling it remastered, I think, is silly, because it's a year-old game, you know?
Yeah,
so it's just...
right. It was just kind of The Last of Us, but with a much better frame rate, much better resolution. That was kind of it. I think they made the models a bit better.
Which I'm happy they were able to do this, because a lot of those 360 PS3 era stuff, like yeah, they looked really nice, but looking back, it's something where when you play them, it's just like, wow, this did not run as well as I remember.
Yeah.
So these PS4, Xbox One remasters did at least help with that, you know. It helped kind of like give us genuinely the definitive versions of these games.
Yeah, I mean, we got a lot of different remasters out of all that stuff. We had stuff like Skyrim was another big one. People make fun of it, but I think Skyrim sold very well on PS4. We had a ton of stuff. And yeah, it did kind of just carry us through those software droughts, because there was always something to play, whether it was new or old. And yeah, you're right. If you go back to a lot of games from that era, they don't run very well. The load times aren't great. The frame rate isn't great. So it's just kind of nice to give them, a better legacy going forward. So I think they were fine. There was a lot of pushback at first, but they have their place.
Yeah, for sure. I think there was some times where it just kind of felt like, come on, man. Like, there was a God of War 3 remastered.
That was one of the weird ones, yeah, because the PS3 already had, like, a huge God of War collection, so yeah. It was weird they just did 3 again, yeah.
I think they wanted to push it because, like, there's this weird mental difference that customers have between, like, oh, if it's God of War 3 remastered or something, like, that on its own looks like it could have been a new game at that time, like in 2015, whenever they released that remaster. Where if you did the collection, it's like, oh, a bunch of old games that just still look old or something. I don't know. I don't get it, because it's just like, yeah, like you were saying, like, we had the God of War saga on PS3, which was everything. Yeah. And it's just like, yeah, like, I don't know. That always kind of bugged me. But we haven't really talked a lot about Nintendo, and it's because they had a strange generation with, you know, if you want to consider the fact that, you know, you go from Wii U to Nintendo Switch. They started the generation first, a year before everybody else, but then they introduced a new console before everybody else. They also had a handheld going on at the same time, a successful handheld with the 3DS, and this was also the last generation Sony competed in the handheld space, at least for now, with the Vita. Yeah, I mean, looking back, they didn't really stand a chance with the Wii U. But yeah, what do you think about Nintendo's performance this generation? Because they genuinely had, like, both sides of the conversation. They had the worst selling console and the best selling console.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed the Wii U at the time. It gave me games that other consoles weren't giving me. It gave me that sort of more just gameplay focused Japanese developed side, which was something that was quite weak in that era. And the Wii U had a bunch of decent games, but you couldn't really rely on it as a primary console. You kind of needed it alongside a PC or a PS4 and Xbox. So it was kind of miserable on its own. When Vita was announced as NGP, I do remember there being a lot of the more involved gamers were kind of like, they thought NGP had it like locked in. It was the more powerful system. It had a touchpad, it had an OLED screen. It was similar price to 3DS. And I think it kind of shocked a lot of the core when Vita didn't take off. It
felt like PSP versus DS all over again, but yeah. Even more like just worse performance across both handhelds. Because like PSP still did very well, but it sold like half of the DS, which literally became like the best-selling console of all time, roughly. Where the 3DS versus the PS Vita, this was during the era in which smartphones were kind of taking over and becoming much more feasible for the general consumer.
All the analysts were saying there's no room for handhelds anymore. This is over. Yeah.
This was when everybody started to use smartphones. Like back in 2007, when the DS and PSP were still relevant. And the iPhone came out. That was still like, I remember like my parents seeing that and being like, well, that's kind of cool, but it's $500. You know, these things were still way too pricey, and they did not have like an app ecosystem or anything like that. But around the time the 3DS and Vita launched, like this was when people, like everybody started owning smartphones or smartphone equivalents with stuff like iPod Touches or iPads and whatnot. And yeah, like for a general consumer, it started to make it didn't make much sense to own a 3DS or Vita. You had your phone and you could just buy all these games on it, or you could just play games for free. So why own these things? But I think as the years went on, you can see this with the Switch, how people are just more willing to just say, you know what, I know my phone can do this, but I want a product that specializes in this kind of thing because it's more fun. So unfortunately, I feel like the Vita would have done much better if it released like now.
I think so too.
And I think if it released now, it would still hold up pretty well. Like it still looks good, plays good, feels good, all of that. It's really unfortunate what happened with it because they genuinely did try with it for that first year.
They made a good system.
Yeah, but then after that, they just kind of made it like, we'll just let indies kind of take over this. And they did. They did well, you know. It became a cool little indie device.
Yeah, I think both 3DS and Vita just kind of showed that unconditional success is never guaranteed. Like, you can make a cool system with great hardware and great gimmicks, but people won't be around if the games aren't there. 3DS took a while. Look, its first year was very nerve-wracking as a consumer, because it launched and it got a price cut within months. And the games just weren't there. Like, Nintendogs kicked off the system, which I think they expected to be big, but it wasn't really. It took until Mario 3D Land and Mario Kart 7 to really become notable, and that was at the end of that year. And I think it took until Pokemon for it to really become big and mainstream. And like stuff like Mario and Pokemon, they're stuff you can't find on smartphones. I think that's just kind of... Like, to your average person, if there's cheap hardware, and there's Pokemon, and there's Mario, you're probably going to buy it. Whereas Vita... it never really had that. Like, there were some big games that they were pushing at the start, like Killzone and Resistance and Uncharted, which were big, and they got some big third-party games, like Call of Duty was on Vita. They definitely did try, but I think they cut their losses early, and they just kind of stopped trying.
Yeah, I think the 3DS became kind of the cheap Nintendo player for a lot of people this generation. I saw a lot of people, like, buy a 3DS just to play Pokemon or Zelda or Mario for a little bit, and then maybe just throw it in a drawer. But yeah, overall, in the grand scheme of like Nintendo handhelds, the 3DS still did good. Like, it's still, 75 million units, but like you were saying, like, oh, Xbox One may have sold like 60 million, and that's still like, that did okay. And 3DS still sold more than that. But, like, yeah, in the grand scheme of Nintendo handhelds, like, GBA sold more, DS sold more, the original Game Boy sold more, all of that. It was still a lower seller, which I think just showed the state of the market at the time for handhelds. So, like, if Nintendo still, like, kind of had, like, one of their weaker selling platforms this generation, that just shows, like, how unlikely it was that the Vita was going to do anywhere close to that. It's pretty nuts to look back at like articles that were saying like Vita is just gonna, like, come on, like Vita's gonna clean house. They had a lot of great titles that first year of Vita for like the general like variety North American gamer, I guess. You had your Call of Duty, Black Ops Declassified, which horrible, but still. But you had Uncharted, which was good on Vita. It was good. And you also had Mod Nation Racers. You had Tearaway, which was 2013, but still. You had Gravity Rush. You had you had a lot of cool third-party support with Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 and Rayman Origins and Sonic and All-Stars. There's a lot of good stuff on Vita, but it was at the wrong place at the wrong time, I think. If it launched the generation prior, which would have been crazy to see this amazing handheld that generation, but if it would have launched generation prior or generation later, I think it would have done much better. But Nintendo decided to kind of reset things halfway through the generation with the Switch, which is, yeah, like we were saying, like, still could be considered 8th gen. Were you surprised with how much of a success it was?
Yeah, I don't think anyone knew what to expect with the Switch. Like, when we saw that trailer for the first time, I knew I wanted one. I think after the Wii U, though, nothing was guaranteed. And even after 3DS, like, 3DS was a success, but it was like a PSP level success. It wasn't like a Nintendo dominating success. It was so hard to say whether it was going to be big or not. I'm very happy with where they went, though. I think it was very clever to merge handheld and console together, because clearly something had to give with Nintendo. They hadn't been big in the console space. I mean, disregarding the Wii, they hadn't been big since the Super Nintendo, really. And the Wii really had, its gimmick carrying it, and you can't really Like, clearly lightning didn't strike twice with that. So it was hard to say whether they would be a success or not, but I think it was clever to basically ditch console entirely and sort of double down on the handheld space.
It is pretty wild how they pretty much just skip over Wii U whenever they talk about the previous generation. Like, I rewatched the Mario plus Rabbids reveal at E3 2017. The CEO of Ubisoft is like, with Miyamoto on stage, he was talking about their relationship with Nintendo, and he's just like, we have such a great relationship with Nintendo, through the DS and Wii, and now with the Nintendo Switch. And even like there was like some like I think like Nintendo infographic or whatever, like maybe like during an investor meeting that just showed like the Wii and DS and then Switch, like it's almost like the first, like, I think they consider this to be their 8th generation console, as if the Wii U was pretty much just like them gave them a lot of time to build a bunch of games that they could then bring over to Switch, or use that knowledge to create the Nintendo Switch. It makes sense looking back at it all. During the Wii U era, I still had some fun. I still had some enjoyment during that. And I think the games looked good. They played fine enough. It is something where I thought about it recently. The Bayonetta series has been consistently like on the exact same style of hardware, like pretty much 360 level stuff. And Bayonetta 2 was like, oh my god, like this is crazy to see this. But I feel like Bayonetta 3 still looks really good, but it's not as impressive to me, and that's definitely because like it's still on the same level of hardware. And they made some improvements to like character models and all of that. But it feels like Bayonetta 2 was like really shocking back then with how they were able to do that on Wii U, because so much of this generation was still like a bit of cross-gen stuff. 2014 was still like 360 games coming to PS4, and like getting PS4 games getting 360 versions. Like like Middle Earth, you had the Wolfenstein, the New Colossus, all of that, where it's just like you were still getting 360 versions. So like a lot of the PS4 stuff around that time just kind of felt like 360 stuff, but better looking, or just running better. So I think that's why like Bayonetta 2 just felt really like, oh my god, because it felt like something that you might have seen on PS4.
I think with the Switch, you've got to play to its limits. There is a narrative out there that, with like Pokemon, that all Switch games are bad now, like they all look bad. But there are plenty of Switch games that do look really good still. And I think Bayonetta 3 is one of those examples where they went for scale. And with that, it kind of feels old in many respects, like looking at the backdrops or just the graphical fidelity. It doesn't look like it's pushing limits, probably because they're going for like such huge battles with huge enemies. And I don't think that's the best example of like what Switch is capable of, But yeah, there definitely are big Switch games that are struggling, like Pokemon, but there's still plenty of others that do genuinely look great, like Xenoblade 3 looks great. It's something we wouldn't have seen on the previous generation. But yeah, it's a tough position, because I think Nintendo Switch is the best-selling system of this generation, and for a reason. It's because of just how accessible it is to just pick up a system without being dedicated to a TV. You can just play it anywhere you want. And it's cool having like that 360 era of games playable on it. Like you've got like BioShock and Borderlands and Dark Souls and so many others just portable now. Which in the 3DS and 360 in 3DS and Vita era, it would have been bonkers to play that stuff. Like Borderlands 2 was on Vita, but it definitely wasn't like Borderlands 2 is on the Switch. For this generation, I think I enjoyed it for the most part. There were some very big defining games that I loved. Like I loved Bloodborne, I loved The Last Guardian. There's just some great games out there, but I guess it was in some ways less interesting than what came before. One, for just first-party diversity, but also, I think, just in terms of what systems we had, it was just kind of like cut and dry. Here is the Sony handheld, the Nintendo handheld, the Sony console, Nintendo console, Xbox console. That was it. There was no like oddball, like Gizmondo or N-Gage or anything like that. Like we had the Nvidia Shield, which that was kind of interesting as the precursor to the Switch in many ways. But we didn't really have like any weird little guy this generation.
Yeah, I mean like when you go on like the Wikipedia article for 8th generation in gaming, you can see stuff like for all the generations they always have like other consoles. And this generation, I mean it's pretty strange. We don't even see I like Ouya isn't listed here. Yeah, which that might be considered 7th gen. I don't know, but it launched after Wii U, I believe. So
yeah, I think so.
I don't know. I wanna look. I wanna look at the 7th gen. I guess Ouya just isn't anywhere.
We've got to edit this article. That this is a disrespect to the Ouya.
I think like what you were saying, like it felt like this generation has had some of the greatest games of all time in it. I think potentially more than any other generation. I feel like when you look at like some of the greatest games of all time from the 7th gen, I feel like they're just maybe more in the 8th gen. You have a lot of fan favorites in those older generations, whereas in the 8th gen, it's just kind of like, well, yeah, like, you know, like God of War is a masterpiece. Breath of the Wild is a masterpiece. Persona 5. Mostly a lot of 2017 games.
Yeah, like Nier and yeah.
Yeah, like there is so much stuff where it's just like, there is no denying how amazing a lot of these games are. Where maybe in the 7th gen, I feel like some of them may be more up for debate. Where like I've seen a lot of people not really like the Zelda output that generation with the DS stuff and Skyward Sword and whatnot. You know, it wasn't for everybody. But I feel like the quality of this generation was unheard of. Though, quantity-wise, I do wish we kind of had a bit of the best of both worlds, where you look back at the 7th generation, and we had trilogies of, like, these games. You had literally, like, you had 4 Gears of War games. You had Halo 3, Reach, ODST, 4, and then you also had Uncharted 1, 2, 3, The Last of Us. You had all these games, and then pretty much in the 8th generation, we pretty much only got, like, 1 or 2 of each, and they were very spread out.
It's worth noting, too, we didn't get any GTA, apart from GTA 5. Didn't get any Elder Scrolls. It was just Skyrim. I guess Elder Scrolls Online. But yeah, some big franchises just didn't have a new game this generation.
Yeah, which I think that just shows, like, how powerful, like, the last game that they released was, but it also shows just how much longer and more expensive game development is getting. And it does make me question if we're ever going to get to a point where something's going to burst. Like, that bubble's going to burst, where it's just like these companies are going to have to take a look and be like, okay, we can't just keep, like, we're going to have to make this game a little smaller. Like, we can't just try to make the biggest thing possible and employ 400,000 people to make Outriders on Xbox Series X or something. I don't know. Like, it just feels like a lot of these games have way too long a development time for what they are. Not saying like, oh wow, what are these developers doing? They're just twiddling their thumbs. More so like, yeah, it's more so like, I mean, like, I've never developed a game, but I have edited videos about games, which is the same thing. But it is something where, do you ever find where, like, while you're editing something, you may be focusing a little too much on like one very minor edit that has nobody probably will notice. Nobody will probably notice. Probably the only person that cares about it is the editor. And it's something where I kind of have to look at something and I'm like, I just have to move on. I just have to this is fine how it is and move on. And I feel like games are so detailed now, and it's gorgeous and it's fantastic, but I feel like it may get to a point where that bubble may burst and things may have to get on a more like I don't know, just like, hey, AA kind of scale, or just kind of like lower things down a little bit, because how much better can graphics get? How much bigger can games get? You know, it's hard to imagine.
I mean, looking at the biggest games of all time right now, like stuff like Minecraft and Fortnite and Mario Kart 8, I don't think any of them are pushing the boundaries. Like, Minecraft is, you know, stylized blocky. Mario Kart 8 is a Wii U game. Fortnite, it's not like dated or anything, but it's not like the most beautiful game of all time. I think a lot of the masses don't necessarily go for beauty. I mean, we see that Pokemon's like one of the best-selling franchises of all time, and that doesn't go for beauty at all. Do people care that much?
Yeah, I think it's like a good like showpiece, I guess, where it's just like, you know, you can imagine selling a console based on showing off. You know, Sony was able to sell PS5s, being able to show off how good Demon Souls looked now, you know, and it looked fantastic. And you also have, you know, like Ratchet and Clank as a bit of a showpiece, even though it's a really fun game. There's a lot of games that are just like going for like crazy amounts of fidelity and just particles thrown all around. But at the end of the day, you know, like one of the best-selling games of 2022 was Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and that notoriously had like massive visual and performance problems. And And that just shows, like, I think people just want what they want. They just want a fun game, and maybe that, is what Pokemon is. Maybe that's what Ratchet and Clank is. Maybe that's what GTA is, blah, 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 whatever. Like, it just depends on what the game is and if it's good enough for most people. Because, like, you look at, like, even on the mobile space, some of the best games of all time, or not the best games, but most popular, like, what do they look like? They look like, like, it's just, like, probably nothing that
got
crazy.
Some disgusting little mascot.
Yeah, it's just, like, absolutely gross. So, I don't know. I feel like it's gonna get to a breaking point at some point, but this generation, I feel like, has had some of the greatest releases of all time, but it also felt a little safe in some regards, or it also felt like things were just kind of coasting along. And we didn't get as many games as I'd wanted to, and we didn't get some games and franchises that kind of felt like they define generations sometimes, like you were saying with GTA and Elder Scrolls. But at the end of the day, like, I look back at this generation with a lot of I liked it.
Well, good memories.
Yeah, I was gonna say love, but I'm like, I'd say I liked it a lot. I enjoyed it, but, like, I don't know if it's like, wow, oh my god, what I would give for another 8th generation. I'm down to see what the 9th generation has in store, even though it's been a little boring as it started out, but hopefully it picks up soon.
Yeah, I think it would get there.
But as I was saying, favorite and least favorite controller of the bunch. And you can include the buttons and sticks on the handhelds. So, you can maybe include, like, Nintendo Switch Lite, 3DS systems, PS Vita, all of that.
Yeah, it's kind of funny thinking back now how Sony had the DualShock, that original design for 3 generations, and it was so iconic. But when we held the DualShock 4 for the first time, it just felt right. The handles being bigger felt right. The triggers were way better than PS3. I think the DualShock 4 might be my favorite of that era.
Man, see, I might have to disagree with you there.
Oh, okay.
Hey, I felt the same as you for a bit there. When that originally launched, I was like, wow, they really made this controller great. But as the years went on, I fell out of love with the DualShock 4, and I'm not sure. Like, it's just that controller degraded for me a little bit. The battery life is not great.
Battery life's not great, yeah.
Yeah, and overall, just, like, the way everything felt with that controller, I just kind of fell out of love with. And as time went on, I started to respect a little more about the Xbox One's standard design, though I wouldn't say I prefer it. I don't know. I just respected it a little bit more, even though I wish it included a lot of the features that the PlayStation controller did. I do like the balance we have with these controllers. As PlayStation, I feel like they at least are trying to redesign each generation now, which is cool, and they also have more features. But there is a chance that I'm gonna fall out of love with something like the PS5 controller as the generation goes on, where the Xbox controller, it's boring, and I wish it included more features like, gyroscope and whatnot. But I'm not going to dislike the controller by the end of the generation. I know I'm going to be like, this is still going to work well.
It's just a good standard controller, yeah.
It's a very good standard controller. I remember when it first launched in 2013, people didn't really like it as much. It was kind of like going from the 360. They were like, the 360 is perfect. The Xbox One controller, I don't know. And now I played the 360 controller, and it feels cheap. Like, it feels a lot cheaper.
The D-pad
compared.
especially, so mushy, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I would say I did really enjoy the gamepad. I know a lot of people thought the gamepad was very clunky. It's very comfortable. Though my gamepad has a problem with the rumble motor, and it squeaks every time there's a rumble in the game now, so that might bring it a couple steps down. A lot of people really like the Wii U Pro controller.
Not many games really used it. Like, it has a great battery life, like 80 hours.
Yeah.
I don't love the glossy texture. I think the Wii U gamepad gets away with it better than the Pro controller does.
I think the gamepad gets away with the stick placement too, because it's such a unique design. The stick placement on the Pro controller, I just never got behind how both sticks are on top. I don't really gel with that. But technically, since the Switch is a part of the 8th generation, I might go with the Switch Pro controller.
It is good. It is good. It has the battery pros of the Wii U Pro controller. Not quite that level, but it does last a very long time. It's just a nice design, though. It just feels good. It isn't glossy like the Wii U Pro controller. Button placement's good. It's just decent.
It has a strangely kind of soft feel to it, which I like. Kind of like a nice cushiony feel to it. Yeah, I would say that's probably my favorite of the generation. Which I'm surprised none of us said the new 2DS XL button placement or whatever. That one stinks. I don't like that one.